Greetings and welcome to our study in the book of Daniel. Today's lesson is number 8 as we come to chapter 6 of the book of Daniel. And I'm so glad you have joined us by way of video. And these lessons that I'm sharing from the book of Daniel are taught each week to a live class here at our church. And I provide for that live class outlines and handouts of each week's study. And if you are watching this study, possibly for the first time, and would like to receive the same outlines and handouts that I make available to the live class that go along with the lesson, if you will email me at vcauthon, VCAUTHON, at evangelwichita.org, I will be glad to send those to you. That's vcauthon, VCAUTHON, at evangelwichita.org. Also, if you have any questions after watching this study or any comments that you would like to make, I would be glad to respond to you if I can. If you would email me at the same address, I would be glad to try to answer your question or respond to your comment that you would like to make. So thank you for joining us today as we come to a very familiar, well-known, famous story contained in Daniel chapter 6. Before we begin our study, let's ask God to bless this time we have together. Heavenly Father, into your hands I give the next few moments as we study your word together. I pray that your Holy Spirit will give us insight and then speak to our hearts the truths you want us to learn and know. Thank you for your word. Thank you for the opportunity to know it. And today may you be honored and blessed in everything we say and everything we do. In Jesus' name, amen. As we ended last week's lesson over chapter 5 in the book of Daniel, it ends in verses 30 and 31 this way. That very night, Belshazzar, king of Babylon, was slain. Verse 31, and Darius the Mede took over the kingdom at the age of 62. At the end of chapter 5, as we come to chapter 6, there is a change in our historical timeline. On October the 12th, 539 BC, Belshazzar was having a lavish feast as the king of the Babylon and the Babylonian Empire. On October the 13th, the next day, 539 BC, Belshazzar was dead. The Medes and the Persians had conquered the city, captured the city of Babylon, and now Darius the Mede, under Cyrus the Persian, is the regent, governor, king over Babylon and that empire. That night, we moved from the first world empire that God revealed to Nebuchadnezzar. Remember in chapter 2, Nebuchadnezzar's dream of the large statue, and God showed him successive world empires to come. And he said, Nebuchadnezzar, you are that gold head, but coming after you is another empire, another nation. It was the silver. The Medes and the Persians would be that one, and now we're in the rule or the empire of the Medes and the Persians. Now, the events of Daniel chapter 6, our chapter, take place probably in the first couple of years of that rule of Darius over the kingdom of Babylon that they have conquered, the Medes and the Persians have conquered, as Darius is that king. The events of chapter 6 take place in Babylon, and it's one of the most well-known stories in our entire book. It's the story of Daniel and the lion's den. But this story is more than a well-known, familiar children's story that is recited in Sunday school. It is an exceptional testimony of God's miraculous intervention on behalf of his children to spare them or to save them. I call it's a story of miracles. I see three very prominent miracles in this chapter. And as we go through this lesson, see if you can see those three miracles with me today. As we come to chapter 6, Daniel is now in his mid-80s, having spent since his teenage years when he was taken captive by Nebuchadnezzar from Judah and brought to Babylon, having spent now almost 70 years here, he is in his mid-80s. And we find that Daniel has not decided to step back or retire or to shrink from his responsibility. We find him as we come to chapter 6, right in the middle of all the affairs of now the Medo-Persian Empire, after serving Nebuchadnezzar and other kings that followed him in the Babylonian Empire. Let's go to our text, Daniel chapter 6. And if you have a Bible, I would encourage you to take it and follow along. I'm going to read this entire chapter to you, but it's so helpful if you will follow along in the scriptures as I read, and you note what God says there. I will be reading from the NIV. You follow along in whatever version you might have. Daniel chapter 6, verse 1. It pleased Darius to appoint 120 satraps to rule throughout the kingdom, with 3 administrators over them, one of whom was Daniel. The satraps were made accountable to them so that the king might not suffer loss. Now Daniel so distinguished himself among the administrators and the satraps by his excellent qualities that the king planned to set him over the whole kingdom. So we have a picture right here in the beginning of Daniel chapter 6. We have this time stamp that Darius is now the king, and he is setting up the administration of his rule over this Babylonian empire. He divides it into 120 provinces, 120 states, 120 counties, however that might be, and he puts a governor, the word satrap. He puts a governor over each of these provinces, states, and then he assigns 3 administrators to whom these governors will report, so that the king then only has 3 people reporting to him. And as he watched his 3 administrators that he had placed over these 120 in the flow chart of responsibility, Daniel, being one of those of the 3 administrators, so distinguished himself that the king planned to put him over the administrators so that the king only had to talk to one person, and Daniel handled all of the rest of the reports down the line of authority. Now, what was it about Daniel that so impressed the king? It says that he had exceptional qualities. The King James says he had an excellent spirit. He distinguished himself. It said in the NIV in verse 4, verse 3, it said, he so distinguished himself. He was competent. He had an excellent spirit. He had these exceptional qualities. He was a person of character. So the king recognized in Daniel, the 80-some-year-old man, the exceptional qualities of competency. He did his job well. The others couldn't even keep up with Daniel, and he was a man of excellent character. In other words, he reflected his faith in God in how he lived and how he worked. And the king noted this and wanted to put Daniel, because of these characteristics, over everyone in the kingdom. So when word got out of the promotion for Daniel, this is what happens. We pick up the story in verse 4. At this, the note or the word that Daniel was going to be promoted, the administrators, the other 2, and the satraps, the governors, some of them, probably not all 120, but at least a group of the satraps, tried to find grounds for charges against Daniel in his conduct of government affairs. In other words, they want to bring him down. We don't want him to be over us. But they were unable to do so. They could find no corruption in him because he was trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. Finally, verse 5, these men said, we will never find any basis for charges against this man Daniel unless it is something to do with the law of his God. Now, why were the other presidents, the other administrators, those 2, and some of the governors, the satraps, why were they so upset at the fact that Daniel might be placed over them? Jealousy? Yes, it was jealousy. They thought, well, hey, why weren't we chosen? We don't want him over us. But could it have been more? Could it have been that as they looked at Daniel being in charge, there might not be any more kickbacks. There might not be any more under the table, easy perks. You see, one honest man, one man of integrity can throw a wrench into everything. We're not going to let some old guy destroy the real progress, the real thing we've got here. And so these other two administrators and many of the governors banded together to see what they could do to bring Daniel down. We can surely find some dirt on him. And isn't that what happens in political circles even today? That the opposition does everything they can to bring down someone else in a place of authority, possibly over them. No different. It says that these people said, why, Daniel's been a government official for some 60 to 70 years. Surely, man, if you've been in government work for 60-some years, surely there are some skeletons in his closet. All we have to do is find them, and we'll bring them down. But the text says that these who wanted to bring Daniel down, these conspirators, these enemies of Daniel, could find no skeletons. They could find no dirt on him. And as I read that in and of itself, to me, at least, is probably the greatest miracle in all of this story. For they monitored his bank accounts. They audited his books. They talked to his friends. They checked his trash, the movies he rented, the books he read, the grades he even made in school. He was not misusing the palace post office. He wasn't writing any bad checks. He was not sexually harassing any female office staff. There was no Euphrates River development scandal. There weren't any bribes. There weren't any cover-ups. There were no scandals. Wow. They could find nothing in Daniel's life that they could use to bring him down. They could find no skeletons, no dirt. I wonder, is that even possible today? These men who were doing everything they could to destroy Daniel, these men who were looking for the dirt, for the failures, said of Daniel in verse 4, we read it just a moment ago, why, this man is trustworthy and neither corrupt nor negligent. This man's a man of integrity, trustworthy. He's faithful. He can be relied on. He's a man of his word. He's not corrupt. He doesn't lie. He doesn't manipulate. He doesn't abuse. He's consistent. He's not negligent. He's diligent in what he does. When he's given a task, he carries it out. He works hard. He pays attention to detail. These are his enemies who want to bring him down that are saying these things about Daniel. Now, this does not mean that Daniel was a man of sinless perfection. He was a man just like anyone else. Daniel made mistakes. Daniel was like every one of us. But his enemies, in looking at his life, discovered that he was a man of integrity. He was a man who was the same in public and in private. He lived what he said he would do. He was the same in profession and how he lived. He was a person of integrity. Now, this stood in stark contrast to everyone else around him. So these conspirators decided that the only way we are going to be able to bring Daniel down is to find something in regard to his faith or his religion. Now, why did they say that? Why did they pick his faith? Because Daniel's faith was very public. Everyone knew of his commitment to his God. It was a public stand. He'd been consistent over 70 years serving Nebuchadnezzar and the kings of Babylon that followed, and now he was still consistent in serving his God through the rise and fall of empires and leaders. Daniel's commitment to God was public, and they also knew the depth and the strength of that commitment, they realized that Daniel was even willing to die for his faith. What a testimony. They couldn't find any dirt on this politician, this man in the courts of the most powerful nations of the land. And also they realized he was such a man of faith that he would be willing to die for his faith in God. So what did he do? We jump in at verse 6. So the administrators and satraps went as a group to the king and said, "May King Darius live forever. The royal administrators, prefects, satraps, advisors, and government have all agreed." Now, there you see is a lie. They have not all agreed. Daniel was not consulted in this, and I'm sure probably it was not every one of the governors, that the king should issue an edict and enforce the decree that anyone who prays to any god or human being during the next 30 days, except to you, your majesty, shall be thrown into the lion's den. Now, your majesty, issue the decree, put it in writing so that it cannot be altered, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. So King Darius put the decree in writing. Now, these guys, let's give them credit. Here is a brilliant strategy. I believe it was inspired of Satan, that as they go to the king and appeal to his ego and to his pride, "Darius, we have a proposal to you. We want you to make a law, and we feel this is going to be the best thing for your kingdom and for your rule, that no one prays to anyone but to you, Darius, for the next 30 days. Now, what this will do, Darius, is it will unify everybody, and it will be good for the people to realize that you are not only king, but you are like a god." Now, I'm sure Darius, he kind of liked that. He says, well, that sounds pretty good. God for 30 days. That does sound pretty good. Remember, Nebuchadnezzar had done a similar thing. He built that large statue on the plain of Dura, the gold statue, and he said, at the sound of music, everybody bow down and worship him and pay homage or allegiance to it. He wanted everybody to worship him as the king and God over Babylon. So it was a similar appeal to the ego and the deification of the king. King, you can be God for 30 days. And they trick the king into signing this law they knew Daniel would violate. You see, it was their plan. They said, this is the one law that Daniel will violate, because he would be willing to die for his faith. And so the king signed it, and the decree became law of the Medes and the Persians. Now, you need to understand that under the Medes and the Persians, the rule of Darius as the regent, the king over the empire now, was different than it was under Nebuchadnezzar and Babylon. When Nebuchadnezzar made a decree, if the next day he changed his mind, he said, "I've changed my mind, the decree is going to be this." Because Nebuchadnezzar was the sole ruler, he was the absolute monarch, and whatever he said on whichever day, that was the law of the land. But now under the Medes and Persians, their rule and their law was much more like it is even in our land today, that the king, once a law was made, was even subject, like everyone else, to the law. And he couldn't arbitrarily set aside a law just because he wanted to, because the king himself was subject to the laws of the Medes and the Persians that could not be repealed. We pick up the story, verse 10. What will Daniel do? Now, verse 10, when Daniel learned that the decree had been published, he went home to his upstairs room where the windows opened toward Jerusalem. 3 times a day he got down on his knees and prayed, giving thanks to his God, just as he had done before. Now note that last phrase. That's so important. Just as he had done before. Now, here the story gets even more incredible. After 60 to 70 years of government service, they could find no skeletons, no dirt. There was nothing they could charge him against. Wow. That in itself, I call a miracle. Now here is the second miracle I see in this story, that when this decree is made, Daniel does not flinch. He does not compromise. He does not change. We live in a day when people so easily compromise. They look for a way around. They look for a way out. We can get around this. We can manipulate these things so it comes to our advantage. But Daniel did none of this. You see, Daniel was faced with a choice, but each choice had a cost attached to it. Daniel could cease to pray. Now, many of us, if such a law were passed, would say, well, it's the law of the land. We have to obey the law. But if he ceased to pray and obeyed the law of the land, he would lose his fellowship with God. Now, he'd spare his life, but he would lose that fellowship with God. Now, he could pray silently. Now, that's probably what the majority of us would do. Well, there's a law that says I can't pray. Well, let's pray publicly. I can pretend I'm asleep, and as I'm sleeping, I can pray, and I can keep my fellowship with God because I want to pray. So I can just pretend I'm asleep, and I can pray. But if he did that, he would spare his life, but he would lose his testimony before men. Men would look, and they would say, see, Daniel, he obeys that king rather than his God. Or the final choice, he could pray as he always had done, and it would mean his life, but he would keep his fellowship with God and his testimony before men. So it says that Daniel decided to pray, no matter what it meant. And it says, I'm going to pray just as I've always done before. Just as I've always done before. So Daniel, it says, went to his upstairs room, a private place. He didn't walk into the square and put a placard up and hold up a sign and protest this new law saying, here, I'm going to pray real loud in private in front of a raw crowd, get everybody sympathetic to him. No, he just went to his private prayer closet, got on his knees, opened the window towards Jerusalem. Now, opening the window towards Jerusalem, that's what King Solomon had said in his prayer of dedication of the temple. He said, if these people are ever dispersed away from this temple, if they will turn their eyes and pray toward this altar, toward this temple, God hear their prayers. And Daniel knew where the temple, the direction of Jerusalem, the temple, and he was praying toward this, much like Solomon had said in his dedicatory prayer of the temple back in 2 Kings. So he opened the window and prayed. Daniel had a place of prayer, a prayer closet. It was private. This is just me and God. He had a time of prayer. He prayed 3 times a day. He didn't fit God into his schedule. God was his schedule. His appointment with God was set. Everything else fit around that. We tend to say, God, if I get a few minutes around lunchtime, or if I get a few minutes just before I go, I want to pray. We tend to fit God into our schedule. Daniel 3 times a day got on his knees. The posture again. Posture in prayer, we can pray standing up. We can pray driving a car. But there's something about getting on your knees. Getting on your knees is a sign of surrender. It's a sign of humility. Daniel here is over all of the kingdom. He's right under the king. And yet he's on his knees in his prayer closet 3 times a day before his God, praying, requesting. And as he prays, it says he gives thanks. Man, I'd be praying. I don't know how much thanksgiving I'd have under a death sentence of going to a lion's den, but he's giving thanks to God, praising God, recognizing that God is the giver of all good gifts, just as he had done before. That phrase haunts me, just as he had done before. This is what he had done yesterday. This is what he had done the day before. This is what he had done since a youth in building a habit of prayer. Now he was an old man. He did as he had done before. This is what he did when things were good. Not just when tragedy strikes. Not just when the doctor says this might be cancer. Oh, I need to pray. On the good days, on the routine days, Daniel prayed just as he had done before. You see, integrity speaks of what we do when no one else is watching. I wonder, what would our lives be like if we had a habit like that of prayer. So what do the opponents do? Verse 11, it gets almost comical. Then these men went as a group and found Daniel praying and asking God for help. So you see them standing around the corner, looking up as a group. There's a group of, see, his window's open. I hear him. He's praying. Excuse me. I hear him praying. Verse 12, so they went to the king and spoke to him about his royal decree. Did you publish a decree, King Darius, that during the next 30 days, anyone who prays to any god or human being except to you, your majesty, will be thrown into the lion's den? The king answered, well, yeah, the decree stands. I'm God for 30 days, in accordance with the law of the Medes and the Persians, which cannot be repealed. And then the conspirators, they dropped the hammer. Then they said to the king, Daniel, Daniel, King Darius remembers. Daniel, who is one of the exiles, notice how they describe him, from Judah, pays no attention to you, your majesty, or to the decree you have put in writing. He still prays 3 times a day. And when the king heard this, he was greatly distressed. Now, that's what the NIV says. I love the King James here, the New King James. It says he was greatly distressed with himself. And I think that is probably a more accurate translation here. And it says he was determined to rescue Daniel and made every effort until sundown to save him. When the administrators and satraps said that Daniel violates your law, a light went on in King Darius. He realized, why, I knew that. I knew Daniel was committed to his God. I knew Daniel prayed openly. Everybody, I mean, people know that. That's Daniel. We all know that's the kind of man he was. But I forgot that. And I am angry with myself for being tricked, for being duped into signing a law that was specific. He realizes what these administrators have done in tricking him to sign this law so that they can bring down Darius. And he's upset. He is distressed at himself, for he respected Daniel and he loved that old man. He was wanting to put him right under. He said, I can trust Daniel to lead my kingdom. So it says he tried to do all he could. He says, I've got to find a way. I've got to get a way around this law. But he tried all day, and it says he could not find anything. So the conspirators come back. Verse 15. Then the men went as a group again to King Darius and said to him, now, remember, king, remember your majesty, that according to the law of the Medes and the Persians, no decree or edict the king issues can be changed. Verse 16. So the king gave the order. He was caught. So the king gave the order, and they brought Daniel and threw him into the lion's den. A capital punishment for the crime of praying to God. And the king said to Daniel as they threw him in, Daniel, may your God. Now you see, Daniel knew Daniel's commitment. May your God, whom you serve continually, rescue you. Oh, Daniel, I'm sorry. May your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. And King Darius makes a statement of not his faith, but he says, oh, Daniel, you're committed to that God. May he save you. And it says in verse 17, a stone was brought and placed over the mouth of the den, and the king sealed it with his own signet ring and with the rings of his nobles, so that Daniel's situation might not be changed. Oh, Daniel, may your God, whom you serve, continually rescue you. And they put a stone over the lion's den, and they sealed it with the king's signet ring and the rings of all these other nobles. He said, we want our ring on there too. We want to make sure that Daniel's situation does not change. Kind of reminds me of another tomb in which they placed a dead man and they rolled a stone over the opening of the tomb and they sealed it with the signet ring of Rome and said no one is to change the circumstances in this tomb. But let me tell you something, as they put that stone and sealed there so that the situation might not be changed, listen to me. There is no situation that God can't change. I don't care how big the stone. I don't care how many seals. I don't care how bleak it may look. I don't care how impossible you may describe it. There is no situation that God can't change. We pick up the story, verse 18. The king returned to his palace and spent the night without eating and without any entertainment being brought to him, and he could not sleep. At the first light of dawn, the king got up and hurried to the lion's den. Verse 20, when he came near the den, he called to Daniel in an anguished voice. In an anguished voice, the NIV says, Daniel, servant of the living God. Wow, he's gone from the God you serve to servant of the living God. Has your God, whom you serve continually, been able to rescue you from the lions? So Darius couldn't sleep. At the first light of dawn, he's ready to go check on Daniel. I believe Darius spent a very restless night. And I believe as Darius was, now this is not in the scriptures, it just says he had a restless night. I believe Darius began to wonder, is Daniel's God real? Can anyone survive the lion's den? Has anyone ever done that? No. Have I ever seen Daniel's God? No. But Daniel is so committed to him, and it's so evident his faith in God. I believe in the night that Darius may have even prayed. Now, this is not in the scripture story, but possibly Darius said something like this: God of Daniel, if you exist, rescue Daniel who serves you, and if you do, I'll proclaim your greatness throughout my kingdom. Darius is struggling as Daniel is in the den. So after the night, he rushes to the lion's den and cries in that anguish voice, Daniel, was your God able to deliver you? And I honestly believe that there was some delay between Darius's question and the response. Because I believe Daniel was probably asleep, and Darius woke him up. It's early. It's first light. He's still in bed. Daniel, was your God able to deliver you? And verse 21, Daniel answered, may the king live forever. May God send, my God, notice verse 22, my God, Daniel says, sent his angel, and he shut the mouths of the lions. They have not hurt me, because I was found innocent in his sight, nor have I ever done any wrong before you, your majesty. The king was overjoyed, gave orders to lift Daniel out of the den. And when Daniel was lifted from the den, no wound was found on him, because he had trusted in his God. No wound was found on him. The lions hadn't touched him because he had trusted in his God. Now here's the third miracle I see. It's the miracle of God's intervention. It's the miracle of God's deliverance. The lions should have pounced on Daniel. The lions should have torn him limb by limb. But suddenly, as Daniel is lowered into the den, the lions come down with lockjaw. Daniel said God sent his angel, and he closed the mouths of the lions. Now, dear friends, I believe in God's angels. I believe that God can send his angels to the help, to the deliverance of his people. Now, I do not know, and the Bible doesn't tell us what happened in the night, not with Darius, other than he couldn't sleep. Daniel, it doesn't say. Did Daniel see the angel? I believe he did. Was it a theophany? Was it a pre-incarnate visitation of Christ there in the den, like the three Hebrew children, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, in the fiery furnace? Christ walked with them in the furnace. Did Christ come and stand with Daniel in the lion's den? The Bible doesn't say. But let's say it was an angel. The angel simply... Daniel saw him. The angel simply pointed at the lions, or the brilliance of the angel. The lions simply slunk to the corner and laid down and went to sleep. The Bible doesn't say. It simply says that God sent his angel and he has delivered me, because I have done nothing wrong, King, before you. My conscience is clear before you, King. My conscience is clear before my God, and my God has found me innocent in his sight. Now the king is overjoyed. But there's always consequences to anything we do and anything that happens. Verse 24, at the king's command, the men who had falsely accused Daniel were brought in and thrown into the lion's den. So now the other two administrators, the other governors who were a part of this conspiracy, this coup to get rid of Daniel with this incredible plan of not praying to any other god other than Darius, they're taken and they're thrown with their families into the lion's den. And it says immediately before they hit the ground, the lions pounce on them. Now, they're judged for their treachery and their sin involved and touched even their families. Now, when we make mistakes, when we do it, it touches other people. Sin is not just something that is stagnant. It grows. It touches other people. Now, this was probably the law of the land, that when someone was a capital offense, did something like this, that their families, it was probably part of the law, that the families were also judged with them. Doesn't say that God told them to do this. This is just what the king said to do. But it also reminds us very, very forcefully that we reap what we sow. You cannot conspire to kill someone without it coming back toward you. You sow murder, you will reap death. Remember the story in the book of Esther of Haman, who set up a giant gallows for Mordecai, and who ended up on the gallows? Haman himself. So Darius makes a decree over all of his nation, over all of Babylon, over all the territory of the Medes and the Persians. Listen to what King Darius says, verse 28. Then King Darius wrote to all the nations and peoples of every language in all of the earth, all of the people under his rule. Now it's a kingdom, a world kingdom over all that area at that time. May you prosper greatly. I issue a decree that in every part of my kingdom people must fear or reverence the God of Daniel. For he, this God of Daniel, is a living God. He's a living God. And he endures forever. He doesn't change. His kingdom will not be destroyed. It's going to last forever. It endures. His dominion will never end. He rescues, verse 27, and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in heaven and on the earth. He rescues and he saves. He performs signs and wonders in the heavens and on the earth. He has rescued Daniel from the power of the lions. And because of the influence of Daniel, because of his integrity and his commitment to God, God delivered him from the lion's den, and that influence on a king caused this king to make this decree, and the Jews now have favor in the Medo-Persian Empire. And it's Darius and it's Cyrus, the actual king over the whole empire, who will allow these Jews now, they have favor because of the influence of one man, Daniel, that allows them to go back to their homeland, to rebuild Jerusalem, the temple, their walls. We're going to have the stories of Nehemiah and Esther and all of this coming out of the Medo-Persian Empire as the Jews now are going to go back to their land, their 70 years of captivity coming to an end. But it's because of the influence of one man. The influence of one man, a young boy, taken by Nebuchadnezzar, and his influence upon that king that caused in the end Nebuchadnezzar to declare God as his God and his belief in that God. It's because of that influence and that example that Daniel had that Darius now says the God of Daniel is the living, enduring God whose kingdom will never end. What an influence this young boy taken captive in his teenage years into a foreign pagan land has had on kings and governments of the first two great world empires of Babylon and the Medo-Persian Empire now. I wonder, what kind of influence do you and I have in the world in which we live? Do we have an influence like Daniel? But to have that influence, we must be people like Daniel. We must have the same characteristics of Daniel. Daniel was a man of integrity. He was the same in public and in private. When no one was watching, He did exactly what he did when everyone was watching. He was a man who was trustworthy, not corrupt, not negligent in his work. He worked hard. He was someone who people could trust. He had integrity. He was a man of character. I cannot emphasize that enough, because in the world in which we live, where do we find these kind of men? I hear people say, I don't want to do business with Christians. Why does someone say something like that? It's because, well, on Sunday they say one thing, but during the rest of the week, it's another story. They're as cutthroat as anybody else in society. I want to be a man of influence. I want to be a man of character, a man of integrity, a man who people say he's trustworthy, faithful, and not negligent. Secondly, to be a man of influence, we must be a man of prayer. Daniel was a man of great prayer. I think this is going to be one of the keys you're going to see to his life. When we come to chapter 9, we're going to study the prayer life of Daniel. We're going to take a whole lesson. We're going to look at an incredible prayer Daniel prays, and you're going to see the power of his life of prayer. But we see him, even under the penalty of death, going home to his prayer closet, opening his window towards Jerusalem, and praying 3 times a day, seeking the face of God, just as he has always done. If we are going to be people of influence in our world, we also must be people of prayer. And may my prayers touch the heart of God for the needs and the loved ones I have around me. And the third thing I see about Daniel, making him a man of influence, was that everywhere he went, people saw God in Daniel. They saw his faith and his commitment to God. I wonder what people see when they look at us. Do they see? The only God Darius knew was the God he saw in Daniel. And it was that example, that God he saw in Daniel, that touched his life. And he said, as he threw him into the lion's den, may the God you serve continually, I've watched you, I've seen you, I know your commitment. May he deliver you. And it's that God that Darius proclaimed to be the living God afterward. But he saw that God in Daniel. Every one of us today are standing on the shoulders of someone else. Today I am who I am and what I am because of godly, loving parents who taught me and were an example to me, of people in my life, mentors who poured into my life, and I stand on their shoulders. Their influence has made me what I am today. And so the question becomes, what about the people who will stand on my shoulders? Have they seen integrity, character? Have they seen God? Are they covered by my prayers? Will they be able to stand and know God from the example I give to them? What a challenge the story of Daniel gives to us. And as we bring it to an end, we see those 3 miracles. I think the greatest was that they could find no dirt. He was a man of integrity, character. And then there was that miracle. He didn't cut any corners. He said, I'm going to do what I always do. I'm going to do who I am, no matter what the law. I serve my God. That faithfulness that was in Daniel. And then his great faith as he was thrown into the lion's den, faith in a God who was able to deliver. Not only Daniel, but the 3 Hebrew children. They had a faith in God that was able to deliver him. And God is able to deliver us from the dangers. That God is able to walk with us through those dangers and difficulties, as he did for the 3 Hebrew children and for Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace, Daniel in the lion. He walked with them through it. Or as the 3 Hebrew children said, if he decides that he is going to take us home, we trust in his wisdom. And King Nebuchadnezzar, we will not bow down to your idol. Because if God even says, it's our time to die, we're going to step into his presence. We trust his wisdom and his decision. So as we end looking at the life of Daniel, because as we come to the end of chapter 7, things are going to, or chapter 6, things are going to change in the rest of the book of Daniel. We remember a man who had faith in God to deliver, but said, I also trust in his wisdom that no matter what he does, he will do what is right. This is the story of Daniel. Now, the first 6 chapters of the book of Daniel has been this historical timeline, this incredible story of Daniel and his influence in Babylon and now in the Medo-Persian Empire. And as we come to the end here of chapter 6, we really come to the end of Daniel's life. He is going to live for a few more years. It says in the last verse that he prospered under the reign of Darius and of Cyrus, who is the Persian king. And then Daniel's going to pass from the scene. As we come to chapters 7 through 12, we're only halfway through this book of Daniel. Well, we're coming to the end of his historical story. Now chapter 7 through 12 are his journal, his diary, his recording of visions and dreams that God has given to him in those first 6 chapters, his life. And he attaches those sort of as an addendum to his life story. And starting with chapter 7 in next week's lesson, we're going to see some of the incredible insights, prophetic insights that God is giving to Daniel about what he is going to do in the future, until chapter 7 through 12 of the book of Daniel become what is known as the little book of Revelation in the Old Testament, because as we study these prophetic dreams and visions Daniel has, as he has recorded them, we get great insight that helps us to understand the book of Revelation and the plan of God. So buckle your seatbelts, hang on. The story is going to get better. For next week, we begin to look at these prophetic insights God has given to Daniel. May God richly bless you. Until we meet again, amen.